welcome back. All right, in this episode of this Griffin, I want to show a little bit more detail, maybe a lot more detail. You know, I love living in the weeds, okay? You know what I'm talking about. Well, in this particular episode, I want to show you some of the techniques that I used in replacing the motor caps. I'm even going to go into a little bit of detail, all right? That my producer's shaking his head. No, he don't want that. But we're going to go into some detail about the hysteresis curve that's used in these motors to provide additional torque. Okay, because a lot of people think, well, you change the value and you get more speed or something. No, I'm going to try to explain to you why they use capacitors on certain motors to provide additional torque. And it's real important. And I wanted to show you some techniques about how to use contemporary capacitors to replace the old oil can capacitors that were used in the motor in the first place. All right, so let's take a look at that. Motor run capacitors. Going to be swapping those out. Here's what we've got, okay? These are AC motors, so we've got voltage and we've got time. AC signal goes into the motor on a winding, okay? So we've got basically a sine wave, which is a beautiful thing, okay? And these motors have more than one winding. So what happens is that the primary AC signal goes into the motor and it starts that motor up. The thing is that we want to be able to increase torque, not speed. Motor run capacitors are not about RPMs, okay? It's about torque, okay? So what happens is that a winding is getting a principal AC signal, but one of the leads of that AC is actually going through a capacitor. The value of the capacitor is going to be specifically for the phase differential of the winding, depending on how the motor was actually built. Inside the motor, there's going to be all of these poles. Each of these poles is going to have a winding on there. And that's how the current through the coil is basically on a pole piece that attracts a portion of the armature. The armature is the part that spins, the stator is the part that doesn't spin. What happens here with an alternating current is that one wire is going to actually go right to this winding, okay? But there's going to be another winding, a second one, which I don't have room for because I draw so big, okay? And then what happens is that has a wire that comes off and it goes through a capacitor. And by virtue of the capacitor, the AC signal is late. It's delayed because the voltage going in is here, but the capacitor voltage is there, so it's later. So what happens is that you end up with another sine wave, okay, that's late, but this goes to this other winding, which is just a little bit after that winding. So you had like, let's look at it this way. You got 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 and 9, 12, 3, 6 and 9, all right? But there's a winding going to be at 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock and so on, okay? Because I forget what comes after 9. And the capacitor is sending that signal to that winding. So as the armature gets that first voltage, it wants to take off. But the next pole is going to have a slightly delayed signal voltage on it, which is going to then add a little bit more torque, because if you only had 4 pole pieces, 12, 3, 6, and 9, then what's going to happen is that it's going to goose that motor, but it's going to start to slow down a little bit until it starts getting to 3, and then 3 is going to pull that across, and it's going to send it on to 6, and it's going to send it on to 9. But what happens with a second winding, you get added torque and a little bit more speed consistency. That's what these motors are doing. And these motors are going to have capacitors in there really just to maintain accurate torque, okay? Now, the capstan motor is going to be the most critical of these motors and the motor capacitors, because you need a very, very accurate speed control, because naturally the speed of the tape has got to be consistent. So that's important, and that's why the capacitors are there, okay? Now, these capacitors, they're oil-filled capacitors. Now, after they have filled this can up with the plates that will comprise the capacitor, they fill it with oil, and then they solder this shut, okay? and they do the same thing to this. So when you see these rectangular looking capacitors in a machine that you're working on, that's the best way to be able to tell. What I want to do is I want to replace these capacitors. And we're going to do that. But yeah, hey, these are really, really old. And back in the 50s and 60s, I mean, there wasn't a large market for ceiling fans. Ceiling fans are no different than these motors. Okay? Now, ceiling fans are going to be operating at a much lower RPM, so the windings that are in a ceiling fan are going to be configured completely different from these in order to get the low speed, but you still need the torque to get the motor to start. So they use capacitors. Well, lo and behold, capacitors for ceiling fans are perfect for this. And these capacitors that are in here are 2 microfarad and I think 250 volts. So they're not overrated by a whole lot. These capacitors are rated at over twice that. These are rated at 450 volts and 2 microfarad. And it's already half the size of the capacitors that I'm going to be working on. And they're cheap. My God. I mean, I forget, but I mean, I think if you're spending more than $9 a piece on these things, you're being had. I do want to talk about, just briefly, this capacitor here is actually got 2 capacitors in one can, which justifies why it's a little bit larger than the other 2, okay? Because there's 2 capacitors in here. Now, there's a common point between the 2, and then there's a capacitor pole piece lug down here. That's 1.5 microfarad, okay? And then there's another lug up here, which I have removed, okay? And I taped that up. I mean, I could just break that wire off of there, but I like to try to keep things as original as possible, but safe. So this lug up here has got no wire on it. That's because this was marketed for a non-Japanese market, and they operate at 50 cycles per second for their electrical system. We operate in America at 60 hertz, okay? If you get your fingers across them, trust me, they both hurt. You would actually use a jumper to go to this lug to add 0.5 microfarad to the 1.5 to get that motor to have the proper amount of torque at 50 cycles per second. If you're operating at 60 cycles per second, you cut the wire, okay? That changes the torque of the motor, not the speed. And you're thinking, okay, well, 60 cycles per second is going to be faster than 50 cycles per second. So that's for speed. No, it's not. Because inside, on the side that you're looking at, right here, inside here, you pull this faceplate off, and on the capstan motor shaft is a sleeve. This right here. Now, this has actually got a stamp on there, and I don't know if the camera will pick it up. Maybe if I hold it just right, but you can see that's a 5-0, okay? So this sleeve gets put onto the capstan motor shaft. This diameter here for the actual belt from the motor to the capstan flywheel actually wraps around here, but the 60 cycle version is smaller than this. In order to get this to operate at the proper speed at 50 cycles per second, you have to use the extra sleeve, okay? So you add a capacitor to this, is 1.5 plus 0.5 is 2. The fun part is going to be getting these capacitors in place of these. These capacitors, these 2 mic, have a mounting lug. Since these capacitors are basically held in place by clamps that are screwed to the frame, I can take this loose, use one of those screw mounts for this lug, and then just basically splice the wires together. Solder those in place, wrap them with heat shrink, and pretty much be done with it. All the other caps, the oil paper caps, have been replaced. This electrolytic, which is a DC filter for the relays that are in here. That solenoid there is for the pinch roller, basically just, engaging the pinch roller to the capstan. This solenoid here is for the brake release. So the brake bands that are going around these reel tables are controlled by that. There's a mechanism in there that releases both of them at the same time. So that's a wonderful thing. With no further ado, let's go ahead and get some of these capacitors replaced, because I really want to put the juice to it and actually start playing some of my old music. This capacitor had clamps that kind of held it in place. So I'll use this clamp, this mount, for this capacitor, but I have to make it want to hold it. So I'm going to leave this excess up here because this side is going to be sticking more to the capacitor, and I'm going to mount it in there like this. I want the wires and this tab to be toward the right. I'm going to put a cable tie on there. Simply going to snug this up on there and move on. The splice I'm going to make is probably going to be in the neighborhood of 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to use maybe just a little more than 1/2 inch of heat shrink. I'm going to run this down onto these leads. Sometimes it's a good idea to go ahead and tin the wires if you're using stranded wire. .5 and 0.5. When I install the new capacitor, I won't include the jumper hanging loose because there's no point. This is going to be fun because of these brackets that are meant to hold this oil-filled capacitor. This is going to be fun because this capacitor here is so completely not the dimensions of this one. You know what? That really wants to hold on to that a little bit, so that might be a good thing. But this bracket up here, it's just too cramped up in there to try to put a capacitor in this space up here. So we'll use this bracket. Now these wires here are going to be spliced onto that, so I'm just going to put that bracket between the leads of the new capacitor, but I'm also going to put some double-faced tape on there. Now, I will go around this with a cable tie. Because of the geometry of this capacitor and the smallness, the narrowness of that bracket, the cable tie is not going to really want to hold on to a whole lot. It's going to be good for another 60 years. I always like to do the heat shrink first thing. All right, we'll tin that before I strip the yellow end off, because stressing that wire, trying to get the insulation off that yellow wire could affect these twisted together before I get them tinned. And I'm seeing just a little bit of excess stuff up there. Green is by itself on a lug with black. Just going to put the double-faced tape on there and a cable tie. Okay, I'm going to just snug this up just a little bit. I'm going to loosen it back up as I put the cable tie on there, so that way I don't stress it and accidentally rip it off. I like to just pull that off just a little bit and then twist while the insulation is still on there. And it sort of just cleans that up a little bit. That's right, cable ties and double-faced tape. It's a win-win situation. In our next episode, with all the caps all replaced now, we're going to go ahead and take some new readings with these new caps in place and compare those readings to the way the old caps are reading in part 2, all right, to show you just exactly how the new caps are affecting the performance, because this thing is going to be virtually dead on, and I can't wait to show that to you. Patreon subscribers, I appreciate you guys so much. You're getting access to service manuals that we uploaded and merchandise possibilities and access to some of our episodes in greater detail. I think that it's going to be important, and it's going to help you guys out, and that's what we're here for. All right, give us a like if you've liked what you've seen. Give us a thumbs up. Okay, comments. I really appreciate your comments coming in, because it actually helps us put a finer point on some of the things that we want to bring to you. And subscribe. It lets you know when the next episodes drop. But you will know all that. So in that case, we'll just see you next time.